Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Very pleased to have Melanie Kenderdine with us today. Counselor to Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz. Good to have her back here at the Wilson Center. Has been with us a number of times actually over the years, but very pleased today that she will be, this is the first public event, I believe, on the U.S. Quadrennial Energy Review, which is a very important document, the first time that this has been done, and she has led this process, or pivotal in this process. She can tell us more about that in preparing this interagency report. When we hosted Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz last January for his 2015 policy outlook, one of the initiatives he highlighted was precisely the Quadrennial Energy Review, and now we're fortunate to hear firsthand about the QER from Melanie. Melanie, I should say, among other things, is, well, moderating today will be the Center Public Policy Fellow and Energy Lead Jan Kaliski, who co-edited the Center's book on energy and security, which is the basis for our energy series this year. Melanie co-authored with Ernie Moniz, before they returned to government, an outstanding chapter on technology development and energy security, which appears in this book. So she has been a contributor on many fronts here at the Wilson Center, and very glad to have her in her role now representing the Energy Department as Counselor to the Energy Secretary, telling us about the QER. Let me turn it over to Jan, who will lead today's session. Jan.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Andrew, for that great welcome. And it's a great pleasure to have Melanie Kenderdine here with us. As you heard from Andrew, the Obama administration just issued the first annual installment of its Interagency Quadrennial Energy Review. This is indeed an ambitious project, monumental project, and the mandate for it was to help ensure in a dramatically changing energy landscape that federal energy policy is matched to the nation's economic security and climate goals. What a mandate. And Melanie is here to tell us about the first installment, which focuses on energy transmission, storage, and distribution. There will be more installments to follow. I'm delighted to welcome Melanie here. She is, as Andrew said, the lead framer and coordinator for the Quadrennial Energy Review. She is Counselor to U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz and Director of the Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis at the Department of Energy. Melanie served previously as Executive Director of MIT's Energy Initiative, and before then as Washington Vice President of the Gas Technology Institute, prior to that in senior energy posts in President Bill Clinton's administration. So welcome back to the Wilson Center, Melanie, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying to figure out how to distill 350 pages into about 20-25 minutes, so I'm going to talk very fast. We were, when we started working on this document and told to have a goal of 70 to 90 pages, and it's 348. So there was a lot of important analysis in here. This has been a focus of Secretary Moniz's, the Quadrennial Energy Review. Was very important, as Jan mentioned, very important when he came in as Energy Secretary, because he was on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which recommended we do a Quadrennial Energy Review. And the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board in 2010 recommended we have an Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office. And so a couple of the things that the Secretary has been paying attention to and has wanted to do for a long time are actually represented in this document. I'm not going to go into the process. I think that we're going to talk about process and how this all worked and came about in a few minutes. So let me go right into the substance. And I apologize, we just put the document out last week, I believe, and we don't have PowerPoint slides for it yet. We only have the illustrations, and some things look very good in the book, but they don't look great on PowerPoints, so I've had to do a few adjustments. You can't read anything, so I've had to animate it a little bit. The Secretary said, you might have seen him on Jon Stewart last night. He did say that we are in the middle of an energy revolution. As Jan mentioned, I was in the Clinton administration at DOE for 8 years. I cannot believe the difference in our energy space and profile when I was here 15 years ago and what is going on now. Enormous changes in the oil and gas sector, going from oil, gas imports, certainly focused on gas imports to gas exports. I think we announced another license yesterday. The change in our oil fortunes has been unbelievable. The increases in renewable energy generation, 10% of our gasoline supply is now ethanol. And so just enormous changes, by and large, for the better. And so that has affected, however, our energy infrastructure. And the first quadrennial energy review, the first installment, focuses on transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure, the two things that I highlighted out of order. We focused in large part on TS&D infrastructure because it is so capital intensive and long-lived, and it tends to set supply and demand patterns for decades. And so we wanted to, one, ensure that it is resilient, but also ensure that it is robust, because our energy space has changed so dramatically and we expect will change in the future. These are the main focus areas of the quadrennial energy review, and we did not do your typical natural gas, liquid fuels, electricity infrastructure focus. We did baselines on that, but we instead decided to do an integrated approach and across these sectors. And first was a focus on increasing the resilience, reliability, safety, and asset security of the TS&D infrastructure. The one physical infrastructure that we did focus on in the QER is modernizing the electric grid, because it is so essential to all the other energy and, quite frankly, other critical infrastructures. So we focused on that. Modernizing U.S. energy security infrastructures. Those are both physical infrastructures like the SPR, as well as our global energy security agreements. I go on Saturday night to a G7 energy ministers meeting in Hamburg, Germany, and the QER will play heavily in that. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, improving shared transport infrastructures. This is the place where I've seen the biggest change from when I was here before, besides going from gas imports to gas exports, is in improving shared transport infrastructures. We never even thought about this when I was at the Department of Energy before, but these shared infrastructures, rail, barge, our ports, et cetera, is a huge new area of focus that we looked at in the QER. I'm going to start first with the resilience, reliability, et cetera. I'm going to just give you a few highlights of the analysis, and then some of the select recommendations that we have in each of these sections. This is modeling of the Gulf of Mexico, and the dots that you see there are electricity substations. Took a while to get this one right. One of the people who helped me get it right is sitting in the audience, and thanks for his input. I'll tell you who he is in a little bit. But this is looking at sea level rise and inundation, and enormous vulnerabilities as the sea level rises in the Gulf of Mexico for these electricity substations. And it's hard to see here. Places where I have circled show a lot of inundation from sea level rise by 2030. That's not that far away, and a significant increase in substations. The green circles are already vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge, but the yellow and purple, et cetera, are 2030. And so I think it's going from around 250 substations to 400 just in a short period of time that are at risk, and that is a climate change concern. This is a very boring looking slide. That little dot in the middle there, I'll tell you what it is in just a second. That's Cushing, Oklahoma. That's where 10% of our oil moves and is stored at points in time through Cushing. And the lines that you see there are recorded tornado paths. And Oklahoma was devastated by tornadoes yesterday, and the issue that we have discussed in the QER is not if but when Cushing could be affected by a tornado, and they have done hardening work there. It emphasizes the need for infrastructure hardening from severe weather. This is this little map down here in our corner. In the corner, we call it our pestilence slide, and these are increases and threats. Orange is wildfire, green earthquakes. The yellow there in the middle is tornado, and the purple down over here is hurricanes. These are some of the infrastructure resilience issues that we address in our recommendations. These are billion-dollar disaster events, weather events by year, and they are increasing. The important thing here, obviously 2011 over here, you see a large number of billion-dollar weather events. But what jumps out at me on this slide, this graph, is the yellow on there is severe storms. That's not winter storms. There's a separate one for winter storms, and that's not tropical cyclones. Those are severe storms, and I'll say a little bit more about increased precipitation in a second. This TS&D infrastructure, as I've said, is vulnerable to many natural phenomenon, but not just climate-related geomagnetic disturbances, a high consequence, low probability event. But there have been a couple of, I think one in Sweden and one in Canada, and they could be extremely costly. We need to manage against that. Cyber incidents and physical attacks. You've all heard about the Metcalf incident, a physical attack on transformers in California, and cyber incidents, looking at 2013 numbers from DHS, I think 53% of all cyber incidents were on energy installations. The next, in that pie chart that is not on here, the next highest was low double digits, and all the rest of the critical infrastructures were single digits. So cyber is, energy installations are a focus of cyber attack. High voltage transformers are also critical and vulnerable elements of the grid. There is a recommendation in that. And then finally, aging and leak-prone natural gas distribution pipelines raise safety and environmental concerns. This is a graph that shows price differentials at the various price points for natural gas across the country. And you see a large widening there in 2007, very significant differentials around the country. Then over here in 2014, you see a narrowing in almost all price points in the country. We think that is because shale gas is widely distributed across the country, and our gas supplies are significant. But what you do see there is a divergence in the Northeast and New England. That's where, and that those are certainly due to infrastructure constraints. It's the importance of infrastructure. This is methane emissions. I mentioned natural gas distribution systems. The left map over here is Indianapolis. The right is Boston. The yellow, gold, et cetera, et cetera. Those are methane emissions. These are in 2013. And I showed this to a friend of mine who dropped in from Boston yesterday. He was a little horrified. And I said, don't feel too badly. The Indianapolis had a pipeline explosion in the 1980s. And so they, after that pipeline explosion, implemented a replacement program. Massachusetts itself has taken proactive measures, passed state laws, and are working on pipeline replacement program. So they are working on it, but what you can see is how different it is when you have a pipeline replacement program and what you can do for the reduction in methane emissions. These are, by and large, because of old wrought iron pipelines and bare steel pipelines. I thought when we started doing this that these were going to be largely in northeastern cities, like old cities like Boston, but they are pretty well distributed across the country. Certainly bare steel, you have Kansas, California. These are the top 10 states, Oklahoma, and Ohio, and Massachusetts, of course, and New Jersey. But these are widely distributed. Our analysis suggests estimates that it'll be $270 billion to replace all of these pipelines, $250 billion. And many states do have replacement programs, or utilities have replacement programs, but they are 80 years, 50 years, 40 years, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an issue we addressed. We also looked at regional fuel resiliency study. We did regional fuel resiliency studies. This is PAD 1C, I think, oil pads. And our finding there, Florida is heavily dependent on water shipments of refined products. The interior, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, the interiors are very dependent on two pipelines from the Gulf of Mexico. So the weather could be fine here, and if there's a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, the southeast gets significantly impacted. They're susceptible to weather disruptions at ports and pipeline shipments. This was a surprise to me. This is the Upper Rocky Mountains. When we looked at fuel resiliencies, there are refineries in Denver and Salt Lake City, but many of the cities in the Upper Rocky Mountains are dependent on a single pipeline, and they tend to be in earthquake-prone areas, and earthquakes are a problem for pipelines. And then over here, this is the West Coast, PAD 5. PAD 5 is isolated both from an infrastructure perspective and from a geographically, and so we think that has concerns as well. These are recommendations in the resilience chapter, and oops, they're not animated. $2.5 billion to $3.5 billion for a financial assistance program to accelerate replacement of LDC pipelines, updating state energy assurance plans, all of the states and their emergency plans, a $3 to $3.5 billion competitive grant program for pre-disaster infrastructure hardening. Right now we tend to do post-disaster repair and replacement as opposed to pre-disaster hardening. You can modernize if you do pre-disaster hardening, and the return on investment compared to the cost of replacement after a disaster is about 4 to 1, so we think it's a good investment. And a couple other things, we are analyzing the need for additional or expanded regional product reserves. We have a product reserve and a gasoline reserve in the Northeast, which is isolated. I didn't show you there because we already have reserves, but those two reserves in the Northeast operate under different authorities, and we recommend that they operate under a single authority. If you have an emergency in the Northeast and New England, which we did in Hurricane Sandy, it's far easier to use the product reserve than it is to use the gasoline reserve when you need both. Key trends in electricity over here in the upper right, you have very flat rates of growth in electricity demand. You see that flattening out there up to 2040. That is having an enormous impact on electricity business models and is a result of, in part, because of successive efficiency programs. Down below here, you have electricity outages by type of event and lost customer hours. The green is weather, and those are numbers of events, so it's weather and operational issues. On the right, it is hours lost, and hours lost are almost all due to weather and very little to cyber, but we are concerned about it. I'm going to skip through this and show you. These are regional variations in electricity prices around the country, very high on New England and the Northeast. That, I think, is in part due to infrastructure constraints and natural gas constraints, very high in California. I can't figure out why they're high in Colorado and New Mexico. The other ones I understand, I need to talk to my staff. And then Hawaii, everyone knows, is very high. I just bought a condo there, and the electricity bills are enormous. This is a survey. I just want to, it's interesting to me, a survey of IOUs, all of the major business model types in the electricity industry. And their investment drivers. Reliability, understandably, was 48%, said that was their number one investment driver. But over here too, renewables integration, 26%. So utilities are very concerned and working on integrating renewables into their transmission investments. These are recommendations in electricity, but I want to show you one thing. This is important to our recommendations for electricity. This is a map of our federally regulated power lines in the United States. This is a map of NERC, regional entities and balancing authorities. And then this is a map of the regional transmission organizations and the independent system operators. And the point here is that they are all extremely different, and that these jurisdictions have no relationship to how the actual grid is arranged, how transmission works, and how electrons flow. It is extremely problematic if you want to take full advantage of the new technologies that we have, efficiency, distributed generation, storage technologies, because there is a blurring of the lines between transmission and distribution, and these bureaucratic structures are arranged very differently. The states are doing distribution, the feds do transmission, and you have these intervening jurisdictional authorities as well. So it is very problematic for us in maximizing the value of these technologies and the value of nuclear generation, for example, as carbon-free generation. And so we are in no way recommending that we get rid of the state authorities or these jurisdictions. But if we don't cooperate, work together, we are never going to be able to take full advantage of all the technologies that we have. We have $3.5 billion in the QER for grid modernization. These numbers are over 10 years, by the way. It's not 1 year. Provide $350 million a year for, I think it's for 5 years, for state financial assistance to promote and look at do regional reliability analysis and plans, valuation of new services and technologies, not a high ticket item in terms of dollars, but I think, in my view, the most important recommendation on here, if we can do model valuation of these kinds of services that I just described, it will go a long way to helping solve and standardize, solve some of the problems and standardize these issues. And go through this, move quickly here. This is the energy security focus. And this could also be a slide in shared infrastructure, and I've had it in both, but I think it illustrates some major changes in the United States and oil flows. The upper left map is crude oil train loading facilities, those little red dots, in 2010. And the bottom map on the left is the same crude oil loading facilities in 2013. So in 3 years, you have 5 or 6. I counted these one day, and I believe there are 65 in 3 short years. And so you understand why you're having problems with trains. Very hard to see here, but there are also green dots on there. Those are barge oil loading facilities. And so that's another thing I'll talk about in a minute. What this says to me, though, too, historically, our crude oil product flows have gone from south to north. moving crude oil from the Gulf of Mexico to Midwestern refineries. Midwestern refineries don't need Gulf of Mexico oil anymore. They're getting it from the Bakken and from North Dakota, and from Canada. And so a historic change in historic product flows. These are now moving, as you can see, from north to south, a little bit more east to west, east and west as well. But it also says something about congestion in the Gulf of Mexico. That affects our energy security because that's where our strategic petroleum reserve is, and that's another major area of focus. It was designed to move, as I said, move oil from south to north. The SPR's oil value now in oil supply disruption emergency is much more important for us to be able to get oil onto the water than it was in the past. You wanted to be able to move oil inland before. Now you need to get it onto water because you need to move oil to your northeast and to some degree your refiner or your to the west. And to back out, since it's a global oil market, back out oil in the event of a disruption that is actually on its way to the United States. If you could get oil onto the water, could back that oil out and effectively increase crude oil supply in the world in doing so. The commercial facilities in the Gulf of Mexico are full, and this SPR shares space with those commercial facilities. And so there is a significant issue and concern. We know that we can distribute 4.4 million barrels of oil a day from the SPR. That's its design distribution capacity. Whether those are incremental barrels of oil or not is the issue, because you can move it, but you might be shutting in your own production. Okay, so you need to be able to enhance the ability to move incremental barrels of oil into the market. And the SPR is also 40 years old, and the authorities that were written to use the SPR are 40 years old, and we think both the facility and the law that governs its use needs some modernization to reflect the fact that it's now a global oil market. In 1975, we did not participate in a global oil market. We had oil price controls at that point in time. Very, very different market. I'm going to skip through this, except for this is a change, and the map here, the red lines on this map, those are our changes in pipelines, and those are new or pipelines under construction in 2014, and you can see enormous changes moving up at the top there, the Bakken in Canada. They're moving over to, as I mentioned, the Midwestern refineries and moving down to the Gulf of Mexico. Recommendations in the QER: update the SPR release authorities to reflect modern oil markets. We need to invest $1.5 to $2 billion to optimize the SPR's emergency response capability. Again, that means increasing our capacity to get oil onto the water, and the commercial facilities for doing so are congested and full. Skip through that, and let me skip through those. Are relatively minor recommendations. And then finally, there's two more. Shared infrastructure. I mentioned that is a new area of inquiry. This is quarterly numbers. In 2009, we transported about 6,000 barrels or 6,000 rail cars of oil. In 2013, it was 435,000 rail cars of oil in a very short period of time. That's why you're having problems. You have a similar, so and this is a regional problem as well. And as I mentioned, ethanol is now 10% of our gasoline supply. That largely moves on rail. 70% of that moves on rail. This is rail movements of Bakken shale oil time sequence. You can see here, this is 2011, moving largely down to the Gulf of Mexico. In 2012, largely down to the Gulf of Mexico, but increasing amounts going east and west. 2013 even more, and this I found astounding. Look what's happened to Bakken Oil is going by rail to the East Coast refineries. So it is a critical need for East Coast refineries, and pretty stunning. This is coal. Coal moving out of fundamentally the same region. This is the Powder River Basin. 34 states get coal from for power generation from the Powder River Basin. Eight states obtain more than 90% of their domestic coal from Wyoming. And this was a shocking statement in a USDA survey report. They said the magnitude and duration of recent unexpected shifts in supply and demand for rail service have exceeded previous events in terms of both magnitude and duration, including Hurricane Katrina, which caused major disruptions throughout the entire agricultural transportation network. All of these this oil and coal are shoehorned onto an existing system, and it's affecting the price and the movement of a lot of commodities. These are ports and waterways. The cartoon in the upper left, this is the Calcasieu River Ship Channel, and it was designed for two tankers to pass each other. I know they're both going the same direction. They wouldn't normally do that, okay? But it's designed for them to pass, and those are the authorized dimensions, and the figure on the right is what has happened and still exists in some parts of the Calcasieu Ship Channel, and it doesn't say it in the QER. When the ship channel operators came and talked to us, they called this, they call it self-dredging. And the dredging of these channels to authorized dimensions is a pure federal responsibility, and the funds just are not there to do it. And this is the same ship channel where we are very shortly going to be moving LNG tankers through in order to export LNG. And then these are inland waterways. These are hours of lock unavailability on U.S. inland waterways. Our locks were built in the 50s and 60s, most of them. Some of them are 100 years old and hand operated. We have the largest inland waterway system in the world. Again, this is 100% federal responsibility for maintenance of these locks. The purple section there where I have the arrow, that's unscheduled mechanical failures of those locks, very costly. And you're also moving now ethanol, a lot of ethanol, most of it moves by rail, but ethanol also moves. You're competing with coal and you're competing with oil. And there have been significant improvements in those locks. In lock unscheduled mechanical failures of those locks in the last few years. The administration has put a focus on those, but those are tens of thousands of hours that you're looking at of lost time when you in that purple section. So there have been enormous improvements, but there's still significant delays. And we did raise a user fee that pays for this, but it's a problem. I'm almost done, Jan. One more section. Yeah. Again, it's 350 pages. This is, I think, an amazing photograph. That is a wind turbine blade. It is the longest wind turbine blade in the world. It's 80 meters long. It is approaching the length of a football field. And you have to move wind turbine blades. They have to be in one piece in order to withstand the force. And so one of the things that we looked at when you're looking at multimodal transport is moving these very large components around the country. 40% of the value of imports, most of these are imported from into the U.S. 40% of the value of those is moving through Houston. And then moving through to other places in the country, very often on rural roads, small roads, and requires one is very hard on those rural roads to move them to the Midwest where you have good wind resources. But also takes a lot of additional staff time shutting down roads, escorts, et cetera. And so it's expensive, it's problematic, the logistics are difficult, and it's not just the wind turbine blades, the nacelles that you need to move, the cranes that you need to move them off of ships, the ships that you need, all of these things, the trailers that you need to move them on are part of a supply chain that is pretty stressed, and as are the transportation systems. And we would look at a corridor, try and do a transportation corridor study. In here, we recommend $2 to $2.5 billion for shared energy transport systems, largely focused on the port connectors, and that's your roads, barges, rail connecting to the ports, which are significantly stressed. And I mentioned the transportation corridor. I'm going to go through and finally close with integrating our North American energy markets. When we did the QER, we had 13, 14 stakeholder outreach meetings. We had a meeting in Canada. We went to Ottawa, and we had a video conference with the Mexicans. Because we have very integrated energy markets, it's in the interest of everyone. And this map here shows the trade flows, which is about $200 billion a year, energy trade flows between Canada and Mexico and the U.S. And the purplish brown, that is oil moving from Canada and Mexico into the U.S., some leaving the U.S. And I can't tell, electricity are the very thin ones, although Canada, 10% of Canada's electricity generation is exported to the United States. We have it's the North American Energy Reliability Council, and there's a reason for that. And our electricity systems are integrated. The Mexicans, as everyone knows here, have amended their constitution, and the Secretary is now working with his counterparts in Mexico and Canada, and working on doing things like harmonizing data. That is the first step in harmonizing regulation. That's very important for something like in Canada, for example, with rail car safety. We are moving a lot of rail cars back and forth between Canada and the United States with oil in them, and we need to harmonize our safety regulations. And so a couple other things in North America. We are now chairs of the Arctic Council, and would like to be doing some more work with Canada and the Arctic Council on energy production safety and oil and gas production in the Arctic, safety and mitigate the environmental impacts of any kind of production in the Arctic, although it's expensive, and with oil prices, I'm not sure you're going to see a lot of it right now. Partner with Canada and the Arctic Council on energy delivery to remote areas in the Arctic, and then finally promote Caribbean energy TS&D infrastructure and clean energy in the Caribbean. The Caribbean countries, most of their power generation is from oil, and they get it from Venezuela. And we would like to work with them on renewable energy and perhaps a natural gas LNG export infrastructure so that you get both gas and renewables. Anyway, okay, I'm sorry for talking so fast and so long, but thank you very much, and look forward to your questions. Thank you. There's a lot more I didn't talk about.
Well, that's the point of the questions. And thank you, Melanie, for an outstanding presentation. This is a huge, monumental effort, as we can see. And the fact that you can give us so much within the space of a short period of time is a great testimonial to your presentation. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about what led to the quadrennial review and the process by which you were able to pull this together, because this is something that involves a large number of stakeholders, both at the federal level and the state and local levels, not to mention people in the private sector area and the like. But just to get the ball rolling on that, you know, one thinks of the defense review, one thinks of the diplomacy review, the development review. It's high time that we have the energy review, and give us a sense of the process which led to this, and where, how you went about doing what you were doing with the White House, and where this will be going forward.
The as I mentioned, the recommendation to do a quadrennial energy review was in the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. It was a study that they did on broader issues, but they recommended that we do a QER, and that was November of 2010, and Secretary Moniz was on PCAST at the time, and so he is. And the recommendation for the QER was to do a very data analytically driven QER. And so that's what we have spent an enormous amount of time. I have 50, 60 analysts working in my office who put this document together and did the analytical work. And so the Secretary and PCAST were very interested in an objective, analytically driven energy policy. Having said that, and you mentioned the QDR, for example, Quadrennial Defense Review is an inwardly focused strategic document for the Defense Department that informs its budget. And the QER, the private sector owns most of the assets that we're talking about in our energy space, and 22 agencies of the federal government have significant equities in energy. And so in order to accommodate and capture both of those threads, the QER is run by the White House. It is co-chaired by John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, and Dan Utecht with the Domestic Policy Council. They co-chair a task force. The secretariat for the QER is at the Department of Energy, where we have managed the interagency review and do the analysis with that secretariat. We also did the stakeholder outreach. We had 14 stakeholder outreach meetings across the country, very formal in the Federal Register. The Secretary went to 9 or 10 of them. That's an enormous amount of time for a cabinet secretary. But I think we actually learned an enormous amount from the stakeholders. This document reflects a lot of the stakeholder input. But we also had 22 agencies that we had to deal with and accommodate their equities and interests. I was telling Jan earlier, the White House put out our draft for interagency review on February 23rd, maybe 25th. And to the 22 agencies that participate in that task force. And we received back 1,100 comments that were not ours, okay? And we had to adjudicate and integrate and edit the document to accommodate 1,100 comments. I have to tell you, the agencies gave us incredibly good feedback. There's a reason why, but it was an enormous undertaking. And we are very proud that after adjudicating 1,100 comments, we were able to get this document done and out within, 2 months. So it does reflect the input of all of the stakeholders that we met with across the country, the analysis of the Secretariat, and the input of 22 agencies, and the oversight of the White House. And I think it's made it a very, very good product. It's receiving good reviews in the press. We also have had 22,000 downloads on our website from around the world. That's my chief of staff said that's an order of magnitude larger than any other report that DOE has had on its websites. And so I think that is a testament to the interest both across the country and around the world in the Quadrennial Energy Review. So.
Well, that's really something, quite a feat to deal with 1,100 comments on an interagency basis and to do that in such a record time. Let me ask you, now that you've received these inputs from these various stakeholders, what your process will be for feeding back to them and more broadly moving from the diagnosis of the problem to some of the steps for implementing the recommendations that will require not only action by the federal government, but obviously there'll be a congressional dimension to that, there'll be a state and local private sector dimension. What is your thought about the follow-up?
We have put together an implementation team in my office. We met with the secretary on that yesterday. We'll put a plan together and take it to the White House to discuss. Probably week after next, because I'm in at the G7 in Istanbul, and the secretary is at G7 as well. So week after next, we will likely meet with the White House on an implementation plan. As you said, there are many actions in here that the administration can do and take. There are many studies and analyses in there that DOE could do under regular order. There are recommendations, however, that both that are costly. You saw the dollar amounts over 10 years. We think they're important. We have to figure out how to fund those. It was always agreed that that would be incremental funding, not out of an agency's baseline budget. Many of those recommendations are at DOE, but several of the large ones at other agencies. And so we're going to work on innovative funding mechanisms for those, or could go in baseline budgets in the future. We don't want to displace other important programs. We just want more money, and it could be incremental funding, is our hope, and then both of the energy committees are moving energy bills. The secretary testified before Senate Energy last week, and is testifying before the House Energy Committee on the 21st of May. And they have been in touch with us about moving legislation, and are very, very interested in many of the things in here. And so I think energy infrastructure is something that could be a very bipartisan effort and commitment, and we look forward to working with the Congress and coming up with a good package, because things are going to move up there, so, which I think is encouraging. So,
one of the striking things is how much more benefit you can get if you invest in advance rather than you wait for the next storm to hit or the next hurricane to create problems that will be multiple in terms of the cost to the country. Do you get the sense from talking with members of Congress that they are aware of the extent of the challenge, and are you optimistic that with the energy legislation that is being pursued, that we can get a real focus on the extent of the challenge?
well, and resilience and reliability is a huge piece of this, as you might have noticed, and most of these recommendations would be implemented through the states. Because the states are where the rubber hits the road on many of these issues, on resilience and reliability, and it makes more sense to act ahead of time. It's far less costly to act ahead of time than it is to rebuild after Hurricane Sandy has flattened your infrastructure. That is very important. But you also, if you do that, you can modernize your infrastructure as well, and so you get a multiple benefits if you invest ahead of time rather than wait until afterwards. And one of the infrastructure projects that the department has been involved in, energy infrastructure projects, and it was Hurricane Sandy. It's not part of the QER. It was part of the Sandy recovery, which is $60 billion. It was not an inexpensive emergency or disaster. And but the Department of Energy, the New Jersey transit system lost electricity. It was a major evacuation route out of New York City, and so it was very problematic. And we worked with the state of New Jersey to design a large microgrid for the New Jersey transit system. And it has, I think it then won an award with that conceptual design that our laboratories and DOE worked with them on. It won a $410 million award to do a very large microgrid. And that's the kind of project that we would like to see funded with the funding that we recommend here for the pre-disaster hardening. It takes care of emergency situations. It's also a very modern approach to infrastructure. That project will have a lot of renewable generation in it, as well as backup generation, and will be able to supply electricity to surrounding facilities when it's not needed for emergencies. So.
You mentioned the G7 and your plan to go there. Will that be an opportunity to multilateralize, if you will, the discussion of the energy review findings? And to what extent do the other countries in the G7 have similar processes, underway or planned?
Well, the G7, we after the Ukraine invasion last year, we had a G7 energy ministers meeting in Rome. We developed a set of principles that were focused on a broad and collective definition of energy security. We have tended to focus our energy security definition on oil, and that's reinforced by the IEA and our collective action on oil with IEA. But this is a broader definition. They clearly have energy security concerns in Europe with natural gas and infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and is ensuring that you have a robust infrastructure and use indigenous resources if your country wants to. They have a lot of shale gas in Eastern Europe. Develop indigenous resources, have robust and connected infrastructures, significant energy efficiency programs, develop your renewables, so a much broader definition of energy security. Those G7 principles are in here, in our energy security chapter, and we are taking the QER to the G7 as a deliverable. This is what we have done to meet some of the principles and address some of the principles in the G7 energy security communique that we put out, and the G7 leaders also adopted those principles later on in Brussels, and so it will be a deliverable. At this point in time, the EU, they have done gas stress tests and have looked at putting out documents and prioritizing projects like gas interconnects in say, Greece to Bulgaria, where that's very important to provide alternative sources of gas supply, alternatives to Russian gas supply in Europe. And so they've done the gas stress test and are focused on their infrastructure and projects, and we hope to do more with them when we go on Saturday night.
Great. I'll be opening to questions in just a moment. Just one other question before I do, and that is, you mentioned cyber as one category to be thinking about. Could you elaborate a little bit about that? That has not been so far an issue, but it could well be an issue in the future, right?
Yes, and we did not. We have an advisory committee at DOE, task force. Secretary of Energy's advisory board has set up a task force subcommittee to advise us on the QER. There is so much work being done elsewhere on cybersecurity that we did not make this a focus. We know that it is an issue and a problem that we all need to be paying attention to, but there's a lot of work being done elsewhere. and we looked at a few things. It's not just for electricity, although electricity is, as I mentioned, everything else depends on electricity, and increasingly so. And so cybersecurity for electricity is obviously very important, but it does, cyber incidents, we did look at a number of cyber incidents on other energy TS&D infrastructure. There were cyber incidents for gas transmission pipes, for example, and so it is an issue. We are going to rely on other analyses to inform us. We certainly spend a lot of time on it at the Department of Energy, and Department of Homeland Security clearly does as well, and our labs do a lot of work on it. But it was not a major focus. It's just something that we know we need to pay attention to, and it's not a cyber incident on energy infrastructure, but problems with the White House hacking, and the State Department, I think a few months ago, had their system hacked, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a serious issue, and could be a high consequence event in certain circumstances. So.
Okay, I saw several hands up. Why don't we start with the hand all the way at the back? And would you please identify yourself before putting a question? Yes, all the way back at the back.
Yes, hi, Hannah Northey with Greenwire.
Hi.
Hi. I wanted to follow up on the meeting you had mentioned and the interplay of the QER on Capitol Hill with energy bills being crafted. Senator Lisa Murkowski, for example, said she would welcome language from the administration on how to implement some of these recommendations. So is that something the DOE is considering, or the administration?
Well, whenever the Congress asks us for technical assistance, we provide it. And so they haven't asked for technical assistance at this point in time. We just sat down yesterday, as I mentioned, to start forming up an implementation plan. There are 63 recommendations in the QER, I believe, and going through and looking at ones that actually do require statutory changes. Looking at, and it's not all of them. It's not actually not most of them require statutory changes. And since this is interagency and across the government, not all of these issues are in the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee either. The ports and inland waterways are not in the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee. There are some very specific issues that are. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is in the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee. FERC and electricity reliability, that's an Energy Committee jurisdictional issue. But not all of them are in the jurisdiction of the committee. But it's very early. I mean, we just got the QER done, and we've slept a little bit, and now we're working on putting together an implementation plan, and that's in process. And so the first thing we need to do is discuss it with the White House, and the Secretary has had his hearings, and we have briefed House and Senate staff, both committee staff and other staff that were interested in briefing. We have briefed them on the results of the QER. So it's in process, and we'll just figure it out very shortly. So thanks.
Right.
We know things are moving, so there's more time pressure, and so.
If you make your questions short, I'll take 3 of them so that we can try to accommodate. Yes, in the back.
Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Melanie. That was just an awe-inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
I hope you get to use that condo in Hawaii soon.
The QER did ruin my vacation there. I thought I scheduled it, and it was supposed to be done, but it wasn't, the QER. So,
2 quick questions. Hopefully the QER will become, in fact, on a regular 4-year schedule, much as the QDDR and the QDR. Do you think that'll be the case? And second, many of your recommendations seem to have real implications for our transportation system. Will those recommendations show up in the transportation legislation that hopefully will be also wending its way through?
Great. And one more question, and then we'll have Melanie. Yes, right in the middle there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rosanna Marie Neal, and I'm with the Sustainable World Initiative. Thank you very much for your presentation, Melanie. I have two quick questions, one on consumption and one on production. On consumption, we all know that energy consumption in the U.S. is the second highest in the world at a national level, with over 2 million kilotons of oil equivalent. And this level of consumption has tremendous environmental repercussions, not the least of which is climate change. Transformative change will be required to address this serious issue, and so my question is, what is being done to lower this number in absolute terms beyond improving efficiency and resource intensity? My second question is, you noted that the U.S. has achieved unprecedented growth in oil and gas production. This also has untold consequences on the environment and public health. For example, in Oklahoma, they have experienced a drastic increase in earthquakes, and in Pennsylvania, they have detected fracking chemicals in the drinking water. What is the Department of Energy doing to create and enforce better environmental regulations in the oil and gas industry? Thank you.
Well, I'm gonna answer these in order, and I should have said we kind of redefined quadrennial, okay, and this was certainly the Secretary's belief and feeling, and is reflected in the presidential memorandum that instructed us to do the federal government to do the quadrennial energy review, is that we want actionable documents. And the energy sector in the United States is and North America is so enormous that trying to do one comprehensive document every 4 years, what you tend to get, and I participated in a couple of them when I was at the Department of Energy before, you get documents that are too generic to be actionable. And so what our approach has been here is to do 4 installments. And so this is the first installment of the quadrennial energy review, more narrowly focused on TS&D infrastructure. And the instruction initially was focused on energy infrastructure. My advisory board said you need to narrow it even further. That's why we came up with TS&D infrastructure. So we didn't look at supply or end-use infrastructure in this QER, and so this is a more narrow installment. Not only do we have to work on implementation, we need to pick the topic of QER 2, and that is a White House decision. We'll be working on that shortly as well. Transportation is a huge piece of this. As soon as we meet with the White House, I think that they're going to be calling in all of the agencies to talk to them about talking with their committees on the Hill. We have not wanted, we've gone to the Energy Committee. That's our committee of jurisdiction. I have not spoken to the Transportation Committee yet. We would like to do that very shortly. The Secretary has had many conversations on this with Secretary Fox. So it is the shared transport infrastructure is an enormous issue, but it's not just transportation. You get into the Corps of Engineers, then MARAD is at transportation, Coast Guard, et cetera, et cetera. There are many agencies that have equities in both your ports and your inland waterways, and so we'll be working with them on implementation as well. I'm not going to go into the statistics on earthquakes and groundwater contamination. I could put on my MIT hat, where we did a future of natural gas study and looked at those issues. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. But this, as I said, the focus of this QER was transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. What you have described, by and large, is either a supply and generation infrastructure or end-use infrastructure, which we did not look at. That was outside the scope of this QER, with the exception of efficiency as an option for infrastructure avoidance. So if you're using your energy more efficiently, you may not need the kinds of infrastructure investments that you might otherwise need. And so we did some scenario work on that. We fully appreciate the need for clean and renewable energy, and have invested an enormous amount and continue at the Department of Energy. But 95% of our vehicles run on petroleum-based fuels, and it will be a while before we transition to other fuels for transportation, which is a particularly difficult issue to address, as I'm sure you know. And natural gas, much lower in CO2 emissions than coal. But we also believe that, and are investing in carbon capture and sequestration for coal and natural gas. The Secretary is very adamant on having an all-of-the-above energy strategy, but it has to be an all-of-the-above energy strategy with the understanding that it needs to be in a carbon-constrained environment. And on TS&D infrastructure per se, the TS&D infrastructure did not have a huge impact on climate. We did look at that. The climate change has a huge impact on TS&D infrastructure, however. That's why there was so much focus on resilience and the climate impacts and the severe weather impacts, because it has an enormous impact on our infrastructures, but not a huge impact in the other direction. One exception to that would be the methane emissions from your gas distribution systems. DOE only looked at TS&D infrastructure in this, and in government, a separate interagency effort on methane emissions. EPA had the supply side of the methane emissions equation. And we are very focused, and do in here, on reducing methane emissions from gas distribution systems. As I said, it's a more powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful than CO2, but it's very short-lived in the atmosphere. And we should not lose sight of the fact that we really need a focus on CO2. But if you get the methane emissions out, you're getting them out, and you can alter the early trajectories. But the long-term problem is CO2. So.
Great. I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time, but I want to thank Melanie again for an outstanding presentation, and thank you for coming to the Wilson Center and engaging this audience.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.